The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry,
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. Well, welcome back to The Divide. Today, Drew and I talked to Tim ONeal, who writes the blog History for Atheists and has a podcast as well of the same title. Tim, himself an atheist, is usually debunking the way atheists view certain historical events in early Christianity as well as into modern history. He'll give his own description of what he's up to, and I think it's a really good resource both for atheists who might be distrusting of some analysis provided by a Christian historian or something, but also for Christians to know about the resource, to use it. I think he does really good analysis. Of course, Christians will disagree with some things, but I think he does a really good job. And of course, he's a resource you can, as a Christian, refer your non-believing friends to. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Toward the end, we get Tim's analysis of why so many atheists, a minority, he will say, are interested or attracted to Jesus Mythicism, which is the focus of our conversation today. Why is it that so many atheists accept what is really a conspiratorial view of history that Jesus never existed? And I think his analysis is really insightful. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, welcome to The Divide. We have with us Tim ONeal, who writes a historical blog on early Christianity called History for Atheists. And contrary to what you might think, Tim is not a Christian. Judging from the title, Tim is himself an atheist. I think he would describe himself as an atheist, and so glad to have you here, Tim.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Drew. Actually, my blog is a bit broader than history of Christianity. The blog is focused on things my fellow atheists often get wrong about history. So I actually range quite widely on a range of topics. I talk about Hitler's religion and whether or not Pope Pius XII was pro-Nazi, and all the way back to ancient history. But one of my focuses when it comes to bad atheist history is the history of Christianity, the origins of Christianity, and of course the whole question of the historicity of Jesus. So, was there a historical Jesus? That's
excellent.
A whole subsection of my site.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. And I've read your other stuff, so I should have known better than to describe it that way. But I've read your other stuff as well. And I'll just add for people who are listening, Christians in particular, I've recommended Tim's blog to many atheists over the recent years because I think it's generally a really good source for historical critical method analysis and so on of history in general. And also in its application to early Christianity. Certainly, as a Christian, Christians are going to differ on some of your conclusions and the way you look at things. But I mean, I think it's a really good place to go. So the question, Tim, that we're putting for you today is about Jesus Mythicism. Do Jesus Mythicists have a point?
Well, it depends on what you mean, I suppose, Bill. Do they have a point? I'm on the record as saying many times that the dismissing mythicism, so the position that there was no historical Jesus at all, is actually not a good tactic. And I see Christians do that. They just sort of say, well, that's a ridiculous idea. It isn't a ridiculous idea. It is at least possible that there was no such person. And we do have some, not many, but some examples of historical, in inverted commas, figures becoming accepted as historical despite the fact they never existed. And we have other examples of figures who were widely considered historical, such as King Arthur, about whom there is a great deal of doubt as to whether there was actually any historical person at the heart of those stories. So it's not completely invalid as an idea. It's valid. Now, sometimes Jesus mythicists leap on that and say, look, Tim ONeal is admitting that we're possibly right. as though what I'm saying is some kind of great concession. It isn't. Many things are possible. What historians do, and as you guys would know, is they take the possible, they eliminate the impossible, they take the possible, and then they make an assessment of likelihood. What is most likely to have happened given the evidence that we have? We can't go back in time. We don't have time machines. We can't go back and observe. So all we can do is look at the evidence, the source material and other pertinent material to the question, and make that assessment of likelihood. So is it possible that they have a point? Yes, it's possible. But that's not saying very much. And as I often say to people, that's not where historical analysis ends, it's where it begins. So is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely? No. And
so
that,
I think
that's
something
very much the conclusion of pretty much every scholar on earth, with the exception of about 4 or 5.
Yeah. So I think this is, sorry to interrupt there. I agree with that, by the way, just making sure people who are Christians here, I totally agree with that. I think it is a valid question someone could entertain, and for the reasons you've cited. So describe for us then what are the core arguments that the Jesus mythicists use. You just said basically there's very, very tiny number of working scholars that would hold the position, but
literally a literal handful, and they're not exactly significant figures. They're kind of fringe figures. Now, that in itself doesn't mean they're wrong. And a lot of people, when I point out the overwhelming consensus on this question, say that's an argument from authority. It's only an argument from authority if you say that and then stop. So if you just say, well, most scholars agree that there was a historical Jesus, and you don't say any more, then yeah, you're making an argument from authority. But pointing out a massive consensus and pointing out the significance of that consensus is not an argument from authority. So why is there this huge consensus? Well, it's because the arguments that the mythicists make are highly unconvincing, particularly to people who are well versed in the relevant material. It looks superficially to many people, particularly people who are maybe biased against Christianity, it looks superficially quite convincing. But it's when you dig down into the detail that the arguments that mythicists make simply fall apart. So what mythicists try to do is they try to say, well, these stories that we have about Jesus, the ones that we find in the Gospels and the ones that we find in early Christian writings, and the ones we actually find referred to by a few non-Christian writers in the early period, these stories about a historical person arose despite the fact there was no such historical person. So there's varieties of mythicism, which means there are varieties of ways to explain how those stories arose. So there's one variety that is still reasonably popular, less amongst the atheist community, more amongst, say, the New Age types, that Jesus arose out of earlier myths about various gods: Horus, Osiris, Dionysius, Mithras. And these stories kind of came together and were reshaped into this story about this guy Jesus. And this is why the story of Jesus parallels these earlier myths. The problem there is that most of those earlier myths don't parallel Jesus at all, and most of the so-called parallels that are cited are either very, very weak or non-existent. They're simply made up. But a much more popular, particularly among non-believers, among atheists, my fellow atheists, a much more popular form of mythicism says there was no historical Jesus. Jesus was originally conceived of as a purely celestial mythic figure in the heavens, and people then told stories about this mythic figure doing stuff in the heavens that then got set on earth, historicized, and so people came to believe that there was actually a historical Jesus. The original conception of Jesus as a purely mythical figure was forgotten, and the stories of Jesus as a historical figure survived, and that's what Christianity is descended from.
Just to be clear, are there mythicists that say two different things? One being the character was invented whole cloth by the people telling the stories, versus there was a historical figure, he just has none of the qualities. Does that also qualify as mysticism, that second idea?
I'd say the second one doesn't, but okay. Some people do get a bit confused and say, yes, I'm a mythicist, but I think
that's an interesting distinction, because I mean, I can sort of have some sympathy for, okay, well, there was a historical figure that everything is imputed to or written about, and these things are just sort of added on. But it seems odd to me that, I guess, to take the leap to, just because this fabrication, or this the Dionysian myth, or the Zoroastrian, because this has been put on this character that maybe did really exist, that means the character didn't really exist. That doesn't follow to me.
Yeah. Look, strictly speaking, mythicism says that there was no historical guy at all. But there are some people who are more sort of casual sort of readers who sort of say, well, I'm a mythicist, but I do believe that there was some kind of guy. I just don't think we can know anything about him. And I think anyone who doesn't believe that Jesus was what Christianity claims he was, like me, for example, I don't think Jesus was the Son of God. I don't think any of the miracle stories happened, or certainly didn't happen the way the Bible says they do. But I do think there was a guy. I think you then have a kind of a gradation between your level of skepticism about the details. So if someone were to ask me what things can we say about the historical Jesus, I'd, with any degree of likelihood or certainty, I'd give you about 5 or 6 things that I'd be reasonably confident about. Then there's a much larger group of things that are said about him that could be true. I mean, when the Bible says, when the Gospels say he then went to Capernaum and he taught this parable, well, maybe, but there's no way we can know. And then there's a whole lot of stuff that I would argue, particularly the supernatural stuff, that I don't think is true at all. So it kind of depends on where you sit on that continuum. And there are some people who sit at the very, very skeptical end and say there's almost nothing that we can say about him other than perhaps he existed. And then there are people who think that there's quite a bit in the Gospels that is historical, but maybe not the bigger miracles. And then there's a whole lot of gradation in between. But true mythicism is there was no guy. That's really what mythicism is all about.
And what is it that leads them, or how do they support making that leap to, not only are these stories not true, they're all made up, but there wasn't even a guy that they were
Yeah.
basing them on?
Look, to a certain extent, certainly at its most naive, it's a matter of all or nothing. So it's almost a fundamentalist thinking of, well, if none of it is, if some of it isn't true, then why should we accept any of it?
It's
And
quite
I
a
get
leap.
that argument. It is, but I get that argument all the time. So I get people saying, well, look, here's stories about this guy. They say he walked on water and fed 5,000 people and raised dead people and rose from the dead himself. Obviously, that we can agree. Those of us who don't believe in the supernatural, we can agree that didn't happen. So why should we believe anything in this story at all? And they leap on that, and then they move from that to look at this story about Jesus. That's a parallel with something in the Old Testament. Therefore, all of the stories about him were made up out of whole cloth, out of bits and pieces of the New Testament and maybe some pagan influence. The
So,
problem
Tim,
with, sorry.
oh, sorry.
Oh,
Could
this,
I just say one thing about that, because it relates to on the Christian's side of it, that
yeah,
I find myself doing the same thing when I'm talking to atheists, but coming from the other direction, saying the same thing. Like, why would you as an atheist uh, make the whole thing about inerrancy? Like nobody looks at Plato or Plato's account of Socrates, or the references from Aristotle about Plato or Socrates for that matter. They don't look at that as if either everything that person wrote is true about this other person, or it's all false.
yeah.
And nobody reads history that way.
No, and the interesting thing I find is that mythicism seems to appeal to people who can only think in black and white and who tend to think in absolutes. And this is why you do find there's a very large overlap between mythicists and people who used to be fundamentalist Christians. They've just kind of gone from one form of fundamentalism to another. So I often come across this. I come across people who, I used to believe that it was all true and now I believe none of it is true. And they don't seem to be able to grasp the idea that there might be a position somewhere in between. And this is I suppose something that really does drive a hell of a lot of people to accept mythicism. The actual proponents of mythicism tend to be a lot more sophisticated than that. But what I would argue is they're a classic case of how you can start with your conclusion And if you're not actually working critically through the evidence to reach a conclusion, if you're starting with that conclusion and then you're trying to find the ways to make the evidence fit that conclusion, that can be done. And you can play that game with anything in history. I've done it in the past, writing speculative historical fiction. If you start with, okay, what if our endpoint is this? What bits of history what bits of evidence can I pull together and shape and twist so that I can get to that point? It's a fun game, but what these guys are doing is they're doing it as a foundation for what is supposed to be a proper historical thesis, and this is one of the major problems I have with it. To answer your earlier question about how do they do it, they really do it by effectively what I just said, by shaping the evidence. So if there's something that doesn't fit with the conclusion that there was no historical Jesus, if there's a piece of evidence that doesn't fit, they either reinterpret it or they exclude it. So they say, well, that's an interpolation. We can't prove that isn't an interpolation, so we're going to treat it as an interpolation. We'll exclude that. This one, oh well, maybe he said he met Jesus' brother, but does it mean brother? Or maybe it's some kind of figurative use of the word brother. Right? So you can play this game endlessly. The question is not, can they make a reasonably coherent argument? Yeah, they can. The question is it convincing? Or is it contrived? And
It
that's the
seems
problem.
like I hate to keep harping on it, but it does seem like there's this like reverse Kierkegaardian leap of faith involved, where you have to say just because I can't prove it means that it doesn't exist. It's a very radical form of skepticism.
Yeah, it is,
And this is coming from the skeptic, so
yeah, that's right, ditto. And the thing is, people often say, "Well, you're biased against mythicism." Well, I'm biased against bad arguments. I'll happily admit that. And frankly, I've got no skin in the game. I don't care if Jesus existed or not. The Jesus that I conclude most likely existed was a Jewish apocalyptic preacher who thought the end of the world end of the world as we know it, was coming in his lifetime, and was wrong. Who got crucified, died, and stayed dead. So it's not like I've got some kind of massive emotional investment in that guy. And if someone were to present me with a good argument, a non-contrived and coherent and convincing argument that he didn't exist, I'd happily accept it. Just in 35 years of studying this stuff, I've never seen that. And the closer I look at mythicist arguments, the sillier they get. There's a couple of points where you can sort of, okay, maybe that makes sense. But at several points in the whole sweep of mythicist argument, you come across these points where the argument is just so contrived and so silly that you just have to go, well, I'm sorry, this doesn't cohere. It just doesn't hold together.
So
I
Tim,
can give you some examples.
the first time that I was introduced to this was in university. I had been an atheist through middle school and high school. And then in university, I converted to Christianity, and I was in classics. And so I was just reading classical literature and philosophy and stuff, but I took a few stuff, that was biblical stuff. But I had a professor teaching classical mythology class. And he took this, it was like a Monday night. And for about an hour and a half, which was probably half the class, because I think we met once a week, I think he went through 23 points of parallelism between Jesus's life and famous myths, and then concluded, therefore, Jesus didn't exist.
Yeah.
So this is part of the parallel, I guess, argument you're talking about.
It is. And there's something called the Rank-Raglan scale, which is this sort of scale of a list of very, very common elements in mythic stories that you find across, the Arthurian mythos, across ancient Greek and Roman, and even Indian and various other mythologies. The problem with applying that line of reasoning, as I think you've obviously identified, Bill, is that a great many of those things can actually be applied to historical figures as well. So the question then becomes, well, okay, does this mean that this person didn't exist, or does this mean that this person became a mythic figure because they were elevated to that level? So when people sort of say to me, well, look at all this magical stuff in the stories of Jesus, that means he didn't exist. I always say, well, okay, does that mean that the Emperor Augustus didn't exist because he was supposedly miraculously conceived when the god Apollo visited his mother Artia when she was being carried in her litter? So does he not exist? What about Julius Caesar? He supposedly, after his death, ascended into heaven and took his place among the gods. So does that mean he didn't exist? What about the Emperor Vespasian, who supposedly healed a blind man and a lame man in front of witnesses that the Emperor Tacitus had spoken to? It sounds pretty rock solid to me, but also sounds pretty unlikely. So does that mean there was no Emperor Vespasian? Obviously, we can get mythic stories told about historical figures. Just because George Washington didn't chop down a cherry tree when he was 10 years old doesn't mean George Washington didn't exist. So that doesn't work. And I'm actually in the process of writing an article for my blog at the moment about how that line of argument, miracle stories means mythic, therefore non-existent, that doesn't work. You can be a mythic figure and still be historical.
Is there any line of arguments that the mythicists throw out that you find harder to
Drew,
refute?
before we go on to another one, can I just finish that one out?
Oh,
I just want to make a comment that C.S. Lewis, famously was hung up on belief in Christianity after he became a theist, right? Believed in God, but was short of Christianity because of the barrier that he thought the Jesus story was basically just mythological. And J.R.R. Tolkien essentially persuaded him that there was such a thing as true myth. There was truth from God in these universal myths. And whether that's persuasive to people isn't the point. The point is that the argument went the other way, I guess, in the case of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, absolutely. But Drew, you just asked, is there any argument that mythicists give me that I find difficult to, was it difficult or find persuasive?
More difficult to refute.
Not really. Not really. But look, I've been over this stuff with a fine-tooth comb for particularly
less
the last
of a leap
15 years.
than that, I guess, because to me that has the same issue that we've been discussing, where you say, oh, well, just because this story has certain qualities, or even the qualities have come along later, then there's no there, you know what I mean? So is there another tack that they take that's maybe not quite as transparently leapy?
Well, not really, because the problem that mythicists has, and this is an argument that I make quite often, is that there's kind of a black hole at the heart of the whole mythicist thesis, because their problem is every single source we have, Christian or non-Christian, traces the origins of Christianity back to this dude, right? Every single one. And they could say, well, that doesn't mean that there was a dude, and that's absolutely true. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but it means that there's a strong a priori case that that's the origin of the sect. Because if there was a dude, then that would explain very neatly why every single line of evidence goes back to that point. So they then have to come up with an alternative explanation for the coherence and consistency of every single line of evidence, all tracing back to a historical dude, that somehow says that happened despite the fact there wasn't a dude. So they have to come up with this kind of proto-Christianity. Most forms of mythicism posit a form of proto-Christianity that believed in a non-historical Jesus. This proto-Christianity then gave rise to the stories about this non-historical Jesus that then became historicized, and then gave rise to forms of Christianity that believed in the historical Jesus, and then conveniently vanished without leaving a trace anywhere, right? Now, this is a major problem because it means the entire edifice of mythicism is founded on a supposition. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with the concept of Occam's razor. Occam's razor basically says, well, look, if you've got two alternative explanations, one of which is founded on actually a series of suppositions, and the other is not, which one do we go with? It's a rule of thumb. It doesn't mean that necessarily that means that's absolutely true, but it's a good solid rule of thumb, which is why it's one that's stood the test of time for the last 700 years. So getting back to that point about vanishing without trace, if there was this proto-Christianity that believed in a non-historical, say celestial, allegorical, purely mythic Jesus, why do we find no trace of it? Because there's several places, it's not just enough to say there's no evidence for this. There's several places where we would perhaps expect to find references to this form of Christianity. One of those, and probably the most obvious one, is in the extensive early Christian literature, where these Orthodox Christian theologians are dealing with people that they regard as heretics. Because we know that in the first three or four centuries of Christianity, Christianity exploded in a whole variety of forms. And the Christianity that we have today developed out of the one that survived. Well, the one that actually eliminated its rivals, but there was this plethora of different types of Christianity who believed all kinds of things about Jesus. They believed that he was just a Jewish prophet. They believed that he was a purely celestial being who came to earth in non-physical form and wasn't actually physical as a human, and everything in between. What we don't get anywhere in the literature that attacks and debunks or tries to debunk these heretical forms of Christianity is even so much as a hint of an early form of Christianity that didn't believe in a historical earthly Jesus at all, and only believed in one who was celestial or allegorical or mythic.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, they try to cast doubts. The mythicists have things that they point to that
Yeah.
says otherwise, but
Yeah.
it does seem, from what I've heard, that these are very sort of seemingly contrived rereadings of things that no historian
Yeah.
really
If I
argues
may say,
about.
that's a part that really has struck me. So, Tim, I'd be interested in your speaking to that kind of generally. Is I'm really big, from my background in classics, on just the most natural way to read the text is the best way, and that doesn't always work in anybody's. It doesn't work in anybody's favor per se. It's just trying to start with some basic understanding. So I read like Pliny, in Latin. I read his letter of his exchanges with Trajan, the
Yep.
emperor, about the problem of Christians in Bithynia. And, like nobody ever in my class, in the classical studies context, was raising the issue of whether there was no such person as Jesus historically. So it just seems such a strain on a natural reading, I guess, of just some
Yeah.
very basic evidence, some of which is outside of the Gospels and Paul's letters, which I myself am, I think find it kind of silly that so much effort is put into discounting all of the literature of the New Testament, the writings of what we call the New Testament, but also some writings outside the New Testament, early Christian writings. So anyway, can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of very valid points there. So, yeah, if Drew, as you say, what they try to do is they try to rope in some stuff that they claim actually is at least residual evidence of this early form of Christianity, this proto-original form of Christianity that believed in a non-historical Jesus. The problem is what they're doing there is, as Bill just said, these are not very natural readings of those pieces of information. So, for example, Docetism, which is a kind of a theological position of a number of these early Christian sects, the ones that didn't survive, believed that Jesus did come to earth, but wasn't a human being. So he had the illusion of humanity, but he was a purely spiritual being. Now, there's all kinds of complex theological reasons why they believe that. But the point is, they still believe that he came to earth. So they still believed he had a historical and earthly existence. They just didn't believe that he was actually a human being. So that doesn't actually help mythicism. But mythicists try to point to references to what seem to be references to Docetism and say, oh, look, they say that these people over here didn't believe that Jesus came in the flesh. So that's a reference to a purely celestial Jesus. Well, unfortunately, again, you've got a supposition and you've got a position held that is supported by evidence. We know that there were Docetists. We know that they did say Jesus didn't come in the flesh, but we also know they said that he was a historical and earthly being at one point. So what are these references to? Well, almost certainly that. So this is the problem. And they also take a text called the Ascension of Isaiah. It talks about Jesus as a pre-existent celestial being descending down through the various heavens and then getting crucified and then ascending back up through the heavens, and the demons in the various layers of the heavens being amazed at what's just happened. The problem with that is that the ascension of Isaiah has him come to earth, and he gets crucified on earth. So what they try and do is they say, well, that bit's added later. Well, you can't just select bits of a text that you kind of like, ignore the bit that you don't like, assume your conclusion, and then use that as evidence for your conclusion. It's this kind of reasoning that they have to use all the time. But probably the classic example of this is, and Bill, you just touched on this, is their reinterpretation of parts of the New Testament to try to make it fit with this idea. And what they do is they say, well, Paul doesn't talk about Jesus as a human being on earth. Paul's always talking about Jesus as this celestial being. So Paul is evidence of this earlier stratum of Christian belief that believed in a purely celestial Jesus.
So born of a woman.
Yeah.
Referencing Galatians.
Well, there's your problem, and I've got a list of these on my website. There's about like 15 references in Paul that just don't fit with this interpretation at all. Yes, Paul didn't talk much about Jesus as a historical earthly person because Paul never met him. So Paul also places a lot of emphasis on the risen Jesus in his Christology and his theology about Jesus. It's the risen Jesus that's the point. And I would argue that Paul believed that Jesus wasn't actually terribly important until he died and then was raised by God and elevated to a much higher status. That's why he doesn't talk about him as an earthly guy.
To the point about Paul's writings just not being compatible with this at all, I mean, it seems to me that there are several points of failure for the mythicist point of view, and it's as you say, it's the rereading of little obscure texts, but it's also the classical historians have to be wrong about the dates the Gospels were written. They have to be wrong about the epistles that Paul wrote, whether or not he wrote them. And it's just, there's so many points of, you got everything wrong. You being the historical, complex, just got everything wrong about the entire New Testament, and it just seems so implausible in that way.
And this is why it begins to take on some of the shape of a conspiracy theory. And a lot of people really like it because they get this idea of, well, I know better than all those those scholars. I know better than Bart Ehrman because I've watched some YouTube videos of Richard Carrier saying stuff. And I get a lot of that. This very smug sort of self-congratulatory, well, I'm smarter than those experts.
I guess if I'm trying to be sympathetic, I would say, if I were a mythicist, I would claim that, well, historians don't really agree with the Christian interpretation either. So we are not unlike the theologians that are trying to argue with.
Although there are a lot of Christian historians who are doing work where there would be sort of a group of well-established facts with the non-Christian historians as well, right, about Jesus.
And the counterpoint to what I just said would be all of those people agree. Even the non-historical, the non-history oriented Christians agree with the historians that Jesus existed. If we're coming down to this, the core point of the mythicist issue.
That's right. And this sort of gets back to what I was saying before about the all or nothing approach. Just because we can, I mean, Bill, maybe you less than Drew and I, but we can be skeptical about the historicity of many elements in the gospel stories. Doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I often argue is that if you look at the gospel stories, there are certain elements in them where the gospel writers seem to be struggling to try and make the story that they're having to tell about Jesus fit with their conception of Jesus. So to give one example, the story of Jesus being baptized by John. This seems to be a little bit awkward for the gospel, for 3 of the 4 gospel writers. It's one of those elements, one of the small number of elements that's found in all 4 gospels. So it seems to be an important story and fairly deep in the tradition. It seems to be something that everyone kind of knew about Jesus. He was baptized by John the Baptist. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, which, as with most scholars, I would argue was the first gospel, the one that was first written, it's not much of a story. He kind of turns up. John's preaching about the coming apocalypse. People are being baptized. Jesus gets baptized. Jesus, no one else, sees the Spirit of God descending and hears the voice from the heavens saying, "This is my only son." And he has this experience, and he goes off into the desert and fasts, and he comes back after he hears that John the Baptist has been arrested and takes up the mantle of preaching the coming apocalyptic kingdom. So that's the story in Mark. The problem for the later gospel writers is that, unlike Mark seems to have had what we call an adoptionist Christology. So he seems to be saying that up to that point Jesus was just a dude, but he got this special favor from God when he was baptized, and that's the point where he became the Messiah. The later Gospels believe that Jesus has been the Messiah well before that. So the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke have Jesus as the Messiah from his conception, and this is why they've got the infancy narratives, the stories of Jesus' conception and birth. But this poses a bit of a problem, because if he's the Messiah from conception and is acknowledged as such by angels and magi and all the rest, then why is he being baptized by John the Baptist? Surely it should be the other way around. Luke gets around this by introducing a story where John the Baptist acknowledges Jesus in the womb. So when Mary visits her kinswoman Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, the baby John the Baptist leaps in her womb, and she tells Mary that, he's just acknowledged your son as being God's chosen. That's Luke. Matthew gets around it because Matthew's a bit less subtle. Matthew gets around it by introducing a bit of dialogue where John actually says, "I shouldn't be baptizing you. You should be baptizing me." And Jesus says, "No, this is how it's meant to be." He doesn't explain why. And then how does the Gospel of John deal with it? Well, the writer of the Gospel of John deals with it by excising the baptism completely. A lot of people reading the Gospels don't notice this, but when you get to the baptism story in John, there is no baptism. John's baptizing everyone else, and then he sees Jesus and says, "This is that Messiah guy that I was talking about." There's no bit where John actually baptizes Jesus. So you've got three Gospels where they're having to deal with the fact that Jesus is having his sins forgiven. That's what baptism was about, by a subordinate. Now, that doesn't make sense for three of the Gospels. It makes sense for Mark. That's the point where he becomes the Messiah, so that's fine. But for the other three, it's awkward. And so all three of them deal with it in very different ways. What's going on? Now, obviously, a Christian would have different ways of dealing with this question, but I would argue what's going on is that the story is historical and is remembered and was a significant turning point for Jesus himself, which is why it is deep in the tradition. But as ideas about who and what Jesus was changed, they had to deal with the story in different ways. So we get a couple of elements in the Jesus stories which are like this. That's one. The crucifixion is another. I mean, the Messiah wasn't meant to be crucified. And so we find the whole of the passion narratives, the stories of Jesus' crucifixion, are laden with overt and more sort of subtle references to Old Testament prophecy that are basically saying this is how it was meant to happen. See, you didn't realize it. We didn't realize it until after he got crucified, but this was part of the plan all along. So the crucifixion does seem to be another historical element that we can hold up. Paul calls it a stumbling block to the Jews and a scandal to the Gentiles, and acknowledges that crucifixion of the Messiah was considered crazy by non-Jews and considered heresy by Jews. So why would they make that up? It doesn't make sense. The reason it seems to be in the traditions is that it happened. And there's a couple of other elements in there as well. The fact that he's from Nazareth was very awkward, because the Messiah was meant to be from Bethlehem, so they have to come up with these stories about how he got born in Bethlehem despite being from Nazareth. Why that? Because he was probably from Nazareth. His brother James is another sticking point, because he's kind of awkward as well for complex reasons. But James is actually very interesting because we have two references to James as a leader of the early Christian sect, where he's referred to as the brother of the Lord, or the brother of Jesus. And one of those is by Paul, who met James and had arguments with him. And he writes in the letter of Galatians about, I didn't meet with any of those guys. Except I did meet with Peter and James, which undercuts what he's trying to say. And then talks about how he got into an argument with him. how can you have an argument with the brother of a non-existent being? Right? So as Bart Ehrman says, you'd think if Jesus didn't exist, you'd think his brother of all people would know about it.
Yeah.
So
That's
there's
an Ehrman kind of comment.
Maybe that's what they were arguing about.
Yeah, it is. But then we've got another reference, which is in Josephus. So the Jewish, non-Christian, Jewish first century historian Josephus makes two references to Jesus. One in book 18, it's the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, highly controversial because it's not clear whether it's original to Josephus's text. If it is, then it's been added to because there's elements in it which are definitely Christian additions. So we put that to one side. I think you can argue endlessly about, is that genuine, is it not? I think it's a moot point. You can argue both ways. But the second reference is in book 20, where he's talking about something else. He's talking about the high priest Hanan ben Hanan being deposed. So that's what he's focused on. But he mentions in passing that the deposition of Hanan was triggered by some executions of some people, including the brother of that Jesus who was called Messiah, James by name. So this is a passing reference to a historical person who was an older contemporary of Josephus, who was executed in Josephus's home city, Jerusalem, when Josephus was himself there at the age of 25, and in a set of political circumstances that Josephus was closely connected to, because it led to the high priest being deposed. Josephus was a member of the priestly caste himself. In fact, had just come back that year from an embassy to the Senate in Rome on behalf of the temple priesthood.
This would have been in the early 60s, right? And Josephus was born in the 30s. Yeah.
Yeah, so circa 62, 63. There's a bit of doubt about exactly which year, probably 63. So Josephus was about 25 years old at that point. And he quite unremarkably, in passing, identifies this guy, James, who got executed, as the brother of that Jesus who was called Messiah. So the mythicists have to tie themselves in all kinds of knots to make James go away because they can't have James as the brother of Jesus, attested by someone who met him and knew him and had got into arguments with him, and someone who was a younger contemporary who's a non-Christian and highly reliable historian. They have to make that go away. So they say, well, in the Paul case, brother doesn't mean brother. It was a cultic title, which doesn't work. And I've got a long article on that on my site. And then they say that the Josephus reference is an interpolation, which almost no Josephus scholars agree on.
That's would to me be a test case, to be honest, that one passage in Josephus, because normally the way you identify someone is by saying they're the son of. I think even in that passage, if I recall, it's been a while since I looked at it, but I think the high priest is described as son of, I think his son is Jesus, right?
The successor to Hanan is a guy called Jesus ben Demnaeus.
Yeah.
So son
and
of
he
Demnaeus.
said, Ben, so he's just identified as son of the high priest, which is the normal way you would identify someone. And in the case of James, he's being identified not by virtue of his father, which is the normal way you would identify someone, but his father was a totally unknown, whereas Jesus would have had some currency. So it made sense that Josephus would connect him to the more known figure in that case. It's such an easy, natural way to read it.
Sure, and I've got an article on my blog about the Josephus reference to Jesus and James, where I look at how Josephus uses those identifiers and make a similar point to that, Bill. The thing about Josephus is that he was often talking about people who had very, very common names. So he's talking about the various people called Jesus. Jesus was the sixth most common name among Jewish men in that period. So he's got lots of people called Jesus. He has to identify which one he's talking about. Same with lots of people called Matthias, lots of people called Johannan, John. He's got various other Jameses as well. And he also has to do this quite a bit with lots of rulers who all had names like Antiochus and Seleucus. So he has to constantly be using various identifiers. He uses patronymics, that's what you were referring to there, son of. He also uses gentilics, where they're from, so Judas of Galilee, and he uses cognomen, which are nicknames. But there's at least one other place that I can think of where he identifies someone by reference to their brother. So there's a Roman, I'd have to look up the reference, but there's a Roman official, and he says this was the brother of such and such. So obviously the brother was better known, potentially better known.
So let me just offer a little summary just so people follow, because you've given some really good data, I think, of just sort of how Tim is saying a historian has to work to arrive at the sensible conclusion that Jesus was a historical figure, and some of these events are real events in his life. A lot of your sort of analysis of things, I might squabble with how you read out some of the stuff about John the Baptist and stuff, but I mean, I appreciate what you're trying to do, and you're trying to read it as naturally as possible. And what does this lead us to, as the way a historian has to work? Let me just take in a slightly different direction to the broader idea of just you sort of alluded to earlier, a kind of fundamentalism behind this. But let me just share with you a story of, very briefly, that I had to pick up Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, for a debate that he was involved in, and he was getting cancer treatment at the time. And so I was tasked to go pick him up on a jet, like a private jet, and fly him to west for this debate. So we got to spend some time together talking. And one of the things we talked about briefly was sort of Jesus Mythicism, but he introduced the topic, when I told him I was in classics. He said, there's some debate about whether Socrates existed. And I found myself just thinking, like, how, this seemed so inane to me. But I thought the only reason he got to say this is because he's obviously heard the Jesus Mythicist stuff, and he's now applying this criteria, I guess, to Socrates, who's, we have multiple, similar to Jesus in at least a generic sense. There's multiple sources. And I just thought, in that one moment, Tim, I thought, this guy's a pretty smart guy, Christopher Hitchens, in a lot of ways, very accomplished, could write, 100 times better than I ever could write. And yet, this is just total nonsense. Like, why are you even suggesting this? So what's the broader phenomenon at play here? And I don't, by the way, I should add, I really enjoyed Christopher Hitchens. I'm not trying to dishonor him, in some way. And he wasn't offering it like it was, like I could tell he was testing, what would I say to that, rather than this is his decided view. So I just want to be clear about that, because he's passed away. But go ahead.
Well, Hitchens, I've read a couple of Hitchens's books, and I remember reading God Is Not Great and taking a sort of a perverse pleasure in some of it, because it's beautifully written, and he's an excellent journalist and a very good polemicist. The problem with Hitchens is that he has he had a certain worldview, and he would pick on certain ideas that supported that, and wouldn't actually be terribly critical or skeptical about them. If they fitted his worldview, he would simply state them as fact. So on history, Hitchens is terrible. So in my article on whether or not the papacy supported the Nazis, spoiler alert, they didn't. I take a passage from Hitchens' God Is Not Great, where he talks about Pius XII being a pro-Nazi pope, and I go through it line by line and show that absolutely every single thing he says in it is factually wrong. But he wasn't actually that interested. In fact, he was because he was a polemicist. But it's interesting that you mentioned
what's going on with the broader. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned Hitchens, because Hitchens, even though he was actually highly skeptical about the historical Jesus, he says several times the one thing that makes him think that there probably was a historical Jesus is what I referred to before. He actually refers to the gospel infancy narratives about how Jesus came to be born in Bethlehem, and then end up living in Nazareth, and the problem with that story for inerrancy, for biblical literalists, is that the Matthew story and the Luke story contradict each other. So what he's sort of saying is, well, why would they be going to these great efforts to explain, in inverted commas, how a guy from Nazareth was born in Bethlehem if there wasn't a guy from Nazareth? What they're doing is they're shoehorning a historical story into a theological framework, which is pretty much what I was saying before. Bill, I saw you squirming slightly when I was talking about the John the Baptist story, so I understand that you and I would probably have some different interpretations, but I'm really talking about this from the point of view of the way in which non-believer secular critical scholars tend to interpret this
and for clarity, my disagreement is not really about sort of the theological stuff about it. It's more just reading how to read the narrative and what the author might aim at it. But again, I wasn't trying to make a big thing of it, other than just I think overall I really liked how you were taking the steps of showing what a historian has to do to read these narratives and decide, up against Jesus mythicism, why you would not be even remotely interested in, or not interested, but persuaded by the position, given the weight of evidence on the other side. What do you think about the broader phenomenon? Like, because in my experience, and you can speak to this way more than I can in the sort of atheist community, is that this has got a lot of energy, but does it really? Is it just in Reddit and on YouTube, or is it? What's your take on that?
Okay, well, I think, and I alluded to this before when I was talking about conspiracy theory. This is one of a number of ideas which does not have traction in the academic sphere, but has strangely gained traction in the popular sphere thanks to the internet. And it's an interesting phenomenon, because if you think about it, like if anyone said to me 10 years ago that flat earthers would be a major voice in the public sphere, I would think you were insane. But here we are. If anyone told us 6-7 years ago about the QAnon conspiracy theory, you'd just say no one in their right mind would believe that. But if you look at polling in the United States, you find that a ludicrous proportion of conservatives actually accept it. So there's something interesting about the way in which the internet amplifies fringe ideas by allowing people to find each other and then allowing them to exist in a bit of a bubble. And this is pretty much what I've seen happening with mythicism. When I first started studying the origins of Christianity and doing research into the historical Jesus, I came across the concept of mythicism because it's been around for 100 years. I mean, 100 years ago, it was considered, wasn't well regarded, but it was carefully considered by genuine scholars and was rejected for the reasons that I rejected. It doesn't make sense as a coherent and persuasive line of argument. But so, of course, I knew it existed, and I was reading in books back in the 1980s, early 90s about, well, there's this line of argument, but here's the problems with it. And so I kind of looked at that and just thought, yeah, okay, I'll consider it. No, I don't think that makes sense. It wasn't until the late 1990s on the internet that I started to see it popping up again. First on conspiracy theory use groups on the early internet, back before the internet had pictures, kids. And I'm very old. But then I started seeing it popping up on atheist groups. And then it really started to take off, when people started producing their own websites. And there was a guy called Earl Doherty who put together a site called the Jesus Puzzle. And he's gone on, I think he's still with us. I think he's now quite old. But he then published a book called the Jesus Puzzle, and he's published another book since. Then it was taken up by a lot in the new atheist movement in the early 2000s. And it kind of began on the lunatic fringe. So there was a online movie called Zeitgeist, which argued for a you might remember, which argued for a kind of like a mythic, amalgam of pagan gods type Jesus. And then that led to more and more people of the anti-theistic atheist variety accepting the idea of a celestial Jesus who got historicized. That was Doherty's argument, and it's since been taken up by Richard Carrier in his book, which he will remind you endlessly has been peer-reviewed, as though that somehow means it's right, called On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Have Reason for Doubt. And so whenever you come across these guys, you come across your friends on Reddit, and you mention why it's not accepted, you'll get Carrier presented to you. Maybe Robert Price is one of the other handful. You get them presented to you as though they're great authorities who are shaking the world of historical Jesus studies. Richard Carrier is an unemployed blogger who has never held an academic position in his life. And
what do you really think of him, Tim?
Oh, what I think of him as a human, that would be another.
I didn't mean that. I was just saying your choice of description.
Carrier, I've said it many times. Carrier's a very clever guy, and he's got as he again will remind you endlessly, he's got a PhD in ancient history from Columbia. He's not an idiot, and he's actually very good at doing what I was talking about before, though, starting with his endpoint and working towards it by shaping the evidence. And some of his arguments, if you don't see what he's doing, look pretty persuasive. But every now and then, when even if you're not fully familiar with it, when he says things like Romans 1:3, where Paul says Jesus was born of a descendant of David, of the seed of David, which is a figurative expression used all through the Old Testament, meaning descendant of. How can Paul be saying that Jesus was a human descendant of a human king? Whether he was or not is not the point. Paul believed that he was a human descendant of a human king, therefore we believed he was a human. So Carrier has to deal with that, and what he does is he twists the Greek to make it sound as though it's saying, oh, he was manufactured from the seed of David. And then he says, and what this means is that Paul believed that angels had taken semen from David's testicles, I'm not making this up, and had taken it into the heavens, and then they created a fleshly but celestial version of Jesus in the heavens out of the semen of David. Now, I've got an article on this as to why that's complete garbage, but that's the level of stupidity that we have to get to in order to twist the text to make it fit the pre-assumed conclusion. That's the problem with Carrier.
So
he's very clever, but
they don't put that on the
something.
front page of the Mythicism pamphlet, do they? That's
no.
not.
And I've actually referred to that argument to an atheist podcaster who then frowned and said, "Oh, I think you might be straw manning him." So I went and read.
I'm quoting him.
So
here's what
Tim,
he says.
when I'm engaged with atheists or at the atheist convention or whatever, this is a group that generally prides itself on being very rational, scrutinizing, critical. So that must mean your blog is highly popular.
I have. Well, no, Bill. But look, I've got a lot of followers on my blog and followers on Twitter who are atheists, probably a majority, and they so to sort of say atheist equals mythicist, I think is completely wrong. Most atheists I know find mythicism ridiculous. Most atheists I know who have actually examined it certainly find it ridiculous. It does seem to appeal to a particular type of dogmatic, anti-theistic atheist, and I've examined over the years why. And I think part of it, there's a number of things going on. Part of it is that all or nothing thinking. It appeals to people who, well, if I reject any of it, I've got to reject all of it. Another part of it, I think, is that conspiracy theory idea. Like, I know better. I'm in on the secret, and I know better than all those experts. So that's part of it as well. But I think another part of it is pure intellectual laziness. You don't have to do the work of trying to work out which parts of the story may or may not be true. You just have to go, oh, well, it's all nonsense. And if you want to pull the rug out from under Christianity, a very quick, simple, and effective way of doing it is saying there was no Jesus, because Christianity is a faith that is based on historical claims about a human being. Now, if you take away a historical human being, then Christianity disappears in a puff of logic. So I think if you put those three things together, you've got a large part of what the psychological drivers are as to why this has become almost an article of faith among a very small number of atheists. And I need to emphasize that, because a lot of people sort of think that if you're an atheist, you have to be a mythicist. And this is why I often have atheists saying, well, you believe there's a historical Jesus, you're not a real atheist. Well, that's a non sequitur. I don't believe he was God. I just believe he was a dude. And that's not actually a remarkable claim. So I think that's a large part of what's going on, Bill. And if anyone checks out my YouTube channel, my most recent video is an interview with Derek Lambert, who is a very interesting, passionate, smart guy who talks about his journey from going from fundamentalist Christianity to hardcore new anti-theistic atheism to mythicism, but then through talking to scholars and actually being open-minded, he's stepped away from mythicism, and he now agrees with me. And I discovered in that interview that one of the reasons he made that step is because he read my blog. So this is why I do what I do, I suppose. There are going to be some people whose minds you will never change, and that's always the case. and you can beat your head up against them. I used to do that. I gave up about 10 years ago because they just don't want to believe. They don't want to accept what I'm saying. But there are other people who are persuadable, and who don't have the background that I've got, because I'm a massive history nerd. They don't have the background to be able to see the problems with mythicism. So what I'm doing is sort of saying, well, look at this, and then tell me what you think. And I get emails probably about once a month from people who I used to argue with 10 years ago on the Richard Dawkins forum and so on, and who told me that I was an idiot and told me that I was wrong. And they now come back to me and say, you know what, I should have listened. You made a lot of sense, and I've read your stuff since, and I've changed my mind. So this is kind of why I'm going to spend the rest of today slogging through another 10,000 word article on why the stories, miracle stories in the Gospels, don't mean therefore Jesus didn't exist.
Really interesting, Tim. Appreciate your insights and experience. But I think probably for Drew and me, we'd say the same thing. He's in interviewing a lot of non-believers in the last few years. I would say it's very rare that we're coming across anybody who's avowing, or espousing mythicism.
Yeah,
I think it's pretty.
But
they're really loud on the. Yeah, but they're really loud in the.
Yep.
In the
because the people who don't care don't contribute to those discussions. The people who are kind of on the fence tend not to. So you tend to get the people who are fanatical, carrier fans, and on the other side, you're often getting Christian apologists, which distorts the picture as to what the vast majority of scholars believe.
But by that you mean they're calling a lot of attention to it and putting out videos against it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and but also they're often presenting a line of anti-mythicist argument that depends very much on biblical inerrancism and biblical literalism, which makes them very easy to dismiss. This is why many mythicists who don't like me, and trust me, there's plenty of those, like to smear me as being a crypto-Christian. In fact, I've got on my blog as a badge of honor quote from Richard Carrier, who I just mentioned. Tim ONeal is a known liar, an arse crank, a hack, a tinfoil hatter, stupid, a crypto-Christian posing as an atheist, a pseudo-atheist shill for Christian triumphalism, and delusionally insane. So
wow.
There you go. That's one opinion on me.
That's quite to the
point.
Well,
I'm glad we've taken a bit of time to talk about sort of the phenomenon, just because really, Tim, because I've read you for a while. I've read some of your stuff, especially the scientific revolution stuff is great too. I've read you, seen people come back. I was telling Tim before the podcast that I've recommended his blog to many atheists, and sometimes I don't get very good, happy responses from that. And but I think it's this kind, like I was even a little bit debating, do we really want to do a podcast just on Jesus mythicism? So I thought it'd be good. Drew and I decided we'd do it some on the content, but then on the phenomenon as well, because it tells you something. And I think too, just for, even though this has been mostly about sort of the atheist side of things, I do think just as we're closing here, I would just want to say to Christians that I think there's sort of Christian versions of these things, some for sure that intersect with Christianity, the Bible, politics and stuff. And I think Christians need to be not just think, oh, this is all just some atheist madness. There's Christian madness too. So so anyway, I don't want to go into all that for this.
Well,
that's a great point, though, because it seems like we need to find some Christian equivalent of Tim to make a history for Christians blog,
right.
Because the point is that no matter what you believe, because Tim is not changing his belief, and neither would this have to change any Christian's belief, but there is a reason to throw out some arguments, not because they don't support your thoughts, but just because they're wrong. And so sure. I applaud you, Tim, for goring the oxes of different kinds of people with wrong beliefs just because it sounds like a lot of them just want to believe anything that supports their core belief of
Yeah,
atheism. Or
yeah. Well, there's a guy called John Dixon who's an academic here in Australia. He's a Christian, and I'm interviewing him for my YouTube channel next week. He wrote a
nice.
book last year called Bullies and Saints, An Honest Look at Christian History, where he does that. He
Oh,
looks at the warts and all of Christian history, and he looks at some of the ways in which many Christian apologists try to deflect some of the uglier aspects of Christian history, try to excuse the Crusades and try to downplay
I
some of
should
the
have
stuff.
I should have expected that that person already existed. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what Google has taught us, that anything you
that's
can
it.
think of already exists on the internet.
So
So
I'm a big fan of John, a big fan of his book, and so I'm interviewing John about his book next
Yeah.
week, and that should be up on my channel.
All right.
excellent.
It may be, by the way, for those of you listening, that this podcast airs after that interview with John Dixon, but it will be on your YouTube channel,
On the
right?
side. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I will say also to Christians, if you, I wholeheartedly endorse that you listen to the interview and the look at John's book. I think it's excellent. So,
And
well,
just,
Tim,
I think we've said
sorry,
it a
good.
couple times, but the way to find you, Tim, is just to Google "history for atheists." That's
Yeah, historyforatheists.com is the website URL. And look, I'd say to any mythicists who might be listening, I'm sure everything I've said, you're saying, but there's counter arguments. Yes, I know. I'm familiar with the counter arguments, and I'm familiar with the counters to those counter arguments. If you go to my website, there's a whole subsection called Jesus Mythicism. There's about 8 or 9 articles there where I go into great detail on all the points that I've been talking about. Now, if you still think you disagree with me, feel free to make a comment, and I'll so long as you're respectful and civil, I'll give you a respectful and civil response. But I'll warn you now, I've heard them all.
well. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing.
Tim, a delight to interview you. Tim's, by the way, in Sydney, Australia, so really appreciate you meeting with us. Well, it's very early your time,
Yep.
so glad you were here. I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.